Hello, my name is Simon Newman, and I'm Professor of History at the University of Glasgow. During the 2 centuries between 1607 and 1808, about 3 million enslaved men, women, and children were taken from Africa to Britain's colonies. Some went to North America, but most were taken to the British Caribbean islands, and over 1 million were taken to Jamaica alone. Having endured the Middle Passage from Africa on slave ships, and then the horrific work regimen and brutal violence of Caribbean plantations, enslaved people had a very strong incentive to resist their horrific treatment. The most dramatic form of resistance was slave rebellion, and on occasion dozens and even hundreds of enslaved people rose up to violently challenge their enslavement. In 1760 in Jamaica, for example, a rebellion known as Tacky's War erupted. The rebels killed more than 60 white people as they violently sought freedom for themselves. Jamaican whites, backed up by the British Army, killed more than 400 enslaved people who they knew or who they suspected to have been part of the rebellion. Some were slowly tortured to death, and their heads and bodies were left on display as a warning to other slaves of what would happen to them if they rebelled. A much more common form of resistance was escape. When a slave ran away from his or her master, the law considered this to be a form of theft and a form of rebellion. A slave belonged to his or her master, and in the eyes of the law, to run away and hide was to steal a master's property and to rebel against that master. Caribbean and North American newspapers were filled with advertisements placed by masters who were eager to recapture valuable slaves who had run away. Between the 1650s and the 1830s, tens of thousands of slaves ran away in the British Caribbean. Some were quickly recaptured and punished. A few returned of their own accord. Others remained free for a few weeks or months or even years, and a very few managed to secure permanent freedom. Men, women, and children, some of them born and raised in Africa and others born in the Caribbean, had their names and cultures stripped away, new names imposed upon them, and their owners' initials branded on their shoulders, their breasts, and their faces. They had been forced to labor on plantations with little food or clothing, whipped. Is it any wonder that people like this took the risk of running away? Although millions of enslaved Africans lived, worked, and died on Caribbean plantations, very few complete plantation records survive. And so we don't know much about these people. But we can gain glimpses of enslaved people in runaway slave advertisements. In many cases, these short newspaper advertisements, usually only about 50 words, are the only surviving record that this particular man, woman, or child ever existed. And these are records showing that the person resisted their enslavement. So the only surviving record of one individual slave is a record of resistance. And here are several examples of slaves who ran away in Jamaica in 1780. The first had been named Caesar by his master, a joke name for a slave who could never have the power of a Caesar or an emperor. He was a slave, not an emperor. His master's initials had been branded onto the back of his hand when he was a child. He had been recaptured once and then escaped again. The second is an unusually long advertisement for 15 slaves who had escaped as a group. There's lots of interesting information here. Some had African names like Cujo, Kwashi, and Memba, although Cujo had been renamed Juba by his master. One young mother, Kate, took her 3-year-old child Samson with her. Samson was going to be a slave for the rest of his life, as would his children. Kent had been born in Africa, clearly given a new name by his master. He was a Moko from what is today Nigeria. He had perhaps resisted or run away before, because part of his ear had been cut off as a punishment, and this was a very frequent punishment for runaways. This advertisement also describes how some of these runaways were branded as property, others had family members on other plantations who may have been hiding them, and some bore the scars and injuries of their work. Runaway slave advertisements remind us that tens of thousands of men, women, and children bravely risked their lives resisting slavery, and we can learn a great deal about them and their lives in the Caribbean from these newspaper advertisements.